The Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to Planted with Sara Payan. I'm Sara Payan, your host, and today we have Vice Mayor and Council Member at Large for the City of Oakland, Rebecca Kaplan, joining us. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm in rainy Oakland this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you and with your listeners.
I'm really excited to dig in with you. I actually haven't had anybody from Oakland on the show, which is weird because I live here. But you have been a great supporter of cannabis in Oakland for many years. And, I just want to start out with thanking you for your support and your critical thought around the issue, because it covers so much more than access to cannabis. It's a much broader issue than some people could ever imagine.
Absolutely. No, this impacts criminal justice reform. It impacts racial justice. It impacts healthcare and access to healthcare and so many other issues that are important to our communities.
Absolutely. And then I'd like to ask you our very first question. I always like to ask all of my guests, what was your first cannabis experience?
The way that I started becoming involved in policy around cannabis came from actually two different experiences I had. I've been a longtime LGBT community activist, and in the 1980s, I was involved in the early days of the movement around AIDS activism and working to get support for people living with AIDS and HIV at a time when the federal government was actively hostile, when they were asked questions at press conferences about it. The Reagan administration would respond by telling jokes about people who were dying, typically homophobic jokes about people who were dying. And even as a high school student, I was working on AIDS and HIV issues, as well as LGBT rights. And on my college campus, I helped run the student group and was involved in HIV prevention education. And a lot of people living with HIV were struggling with access to medical care and with even the existence of treatments. And so the medical cannabis movement, which especially those in the Bay Area and California may know, there was a lot of overlap in the early days with people working on AIDS and HIV issues and finding medical cannabis to be effective for many symptoms that people were not having any other treatments for. And so it was through my advocacy around AIDS activism that I first got connected with folks working on medical cannabis and access to medical cannabis, and seeing it helping people who weren't finding anything else that was helping them with the symptoms they were dealing with. And so that was one really initial, really important exposure. And then I went to Stanford for law school. And while I was there, I had the great honor to study with Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. And I got to work at an organization called Prisoner Legal Services to help inmates who were being abused or suffering in other ways. And so in that context of working on issues of mass incarceration, experiencing over and over people who are victims of the war on marijuana and being targeted for excessive penalties for being in possession of a plant. And not only being initially incarcerated, but then being reincarcerated for cannabis possession, and seeing what a dramatic impact and what a costly and racially disproportionate impact criminal marijuana laws have been having for decades on communities in the United States, particularly since Richard Nixon decided to use ramping up what he called the war on marijuana for his own political aims, in order to target and harass communities of color and communities that he felt were not on his side politically.
Yeah, that was a very problematic thing. It was definitely a war on Black and brown folks and those who were going to be standing up for what's right, as we look back in retrospect. And I think it's something that a lot of times we forget when we get caught up in legalization and just like the business side of it, because we have a much larger group that's involved in the cannabis industry now. But I think one thing that we always have to remember, and I know this because I began my career in cannabis in the Castro, where, I worked with a lot of, I worked with a lot of wonderful folks, and I got to meet and get to know a lot of our elders, our queer elders who have done a lot of work and survived through the AIDS crisis, like Cleve Jones and Ken Jones, who just left us a couple years ago. But that cannabis in many ways is inherently queer. It has a very rich, more conversations about and uplift, because a lot of the heavy lifting and also a lot of the compassion and creativity came out of our queer community. And I think that's something that we really need to talk more about and celebrate. I find every year around Pride, when I start talking about that on LinkedIn, somebody either, private messages me or puts a note on my post, and they're like, tell me no more about this. What is this connection between the LGBTQ community and cannabis? And it's like, if you don't know, you have missed out on so much of our rich history and why we're here today.
Absolutely. And many of the early activists who were willing to take risks at a time when there was a lot of suffering were in the LGBT community and were informed by that activism, and then, ACT UP and the work around fighting for people living with HIV, people with cancer, being part of the movement. And so that has absolutely been essential. And I think the fact that at the time of these movements, it was still considered illegal to be gay, that also, I think, informed the politics of it, that in people being willing to step out and not conform and fight for something that seemed difficult or too radical to fight for.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And in turn, I just find in the community, because of everything that so many people have gone through, there's also this radical compassion and critical thought that comes into play, and creativity that, as we see even in our, even in the cisgendered straight culture, has been a heavy influence, whether they recognize that or not. And I think that that's something that we really need to highlight. And going into the medical usage, I know for myself, when I was in my late 30s going through stage 3 colon cancer, being able to have cannabis as an option, and for those of you listening there, for people who have listened to a lot of the episodes, you know that I come from a family of healthcare professionals, so I am not anti-allopathic medicine or big pharma whatsoever. But there are pharmaceuticals that we use for treatment that sometimes have gnarly side effects that can make things worse. And cannabis is something that in many cases for symptom management can be a very helpful tool for people to forego using certain types of medications. For me, it was opiates and anti-nausea drugs that would have had bad side effects for colon cancer. For, a lot of my friends and family who have dealt with HIV, it gets people eating again. It can help with mood. It can help with anxiety. There's so many things that we can use it for. And that being said, the critical thought about it not being a panacea, there's something to speak to around that as well. And
absolutely. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. No, and the power as an anti-nausea medicine, the power as an anti-inflammatory and as a painkiller, with much less of the side effects or the interactional effects with other medications, I think has been really important. And I know, and we're now into the push for full legalization, which is something I am also active around and a big supporter of. But I think it's important in that context to still not lose sight of the medicinal uses and the medicinal values, and making sure that we continue to make it available for medicinal uses.
Absolutely. And that is something I think that is being more forgotten, because people are like, oh, we don't have to tell that story anymore. It sells itself. We're going to put it out there. We don't want to do the extra work with the outreach. But the fact of the matter is, when we got into legalization, there were more people that were curious about using it for symptom management without having to get a recommendation, without worrying about being on any sort of database, even though they didn't have to worry about that. It was a valid concern. But, a lot of people getting high, and what we saw more of were people saying, hey, I like to talk about using it for sleep, or, I get stressed. Can I use this for stress management? How would this work? And of course, it's a good idea to always talk to your physician about it and let them know what you're doing if you feel comfortable doing that. But it's also legalization created greater access for people to use it for general wellness.
Well, and so for example, some people drink orange juice for medicinal purposes, and some people drink orange juice just because they like the taste.
Right.
But if you're drinking orange juice for a medicinal purpose, you don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops and fill out a bunch of forms to be able to get the orange juice.
Yeah, absolutely. My coffee, by the way, is purely medicinal.
Yeah. Well, and I think, with the side effects that the opioids cause, that also contributes, I think, to some of the interesting politics around cannabis and medical cannabis, that there is such a marketing pushing the opioid, much of what industry on cannabis.
Absolutely. And I know like some of the veterans that I've worked with in the past had said that they were having issues with using cannabis and being able to get the pain medication that they needed. And in reality, you can actually, if you're using cannabis with opiates, it means that you can take less. And a lot of times, and this is probably what these companies are worried about, they're actually able to forego it altogether. And the withdrawal symptoms are much less when they're able to use cannabis in conjunction with that, which I think is an amazing thing. The fact that so many people have stopped or lessened their opiate use, they're not using benzodiazepines as much. These are really good things. Or, Ambien. I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine at work one day. This was pre-cannabis, where she said, I woke up this morning, there was a huge tin of cookies gone. I asked my kids where they were, and they're like, Mom, you were on the phone with your friend and you ate the whole tin of cookies after she had taken her Ambien. And she's like, thank goodness I didn't drive, not remember. Because there are these things that happen with pharmaceuticals where your tin of cookies will not be safe if you're using cannabis, but you certainly will remember the
You will know that you ate them, right?
Exactly.
Well, and then also the issue of the multiplicity of the pharmaceuticals that end up being needed, where you're told, okay, take this painkiller, but then the painkiller causes nausea. So then take this anti-nausea medicine, but then those two cause constipation. So then take this for anti-constipation, right? And so by the point you're now at 4 medicines, that were intended to do something. And, I want to be clear, I'm not against using Western medicine, when it's needed, and it's good to have access to it. And there are a lot of things it's very good for. But there has been a pharmaceutical industry push, both to push pharmaceuticals beyond the level of their need, and also to push against cannabis.
Absolutely. I think that when we're looking at medicine and health, we have to have a more holistic approach where it takes all different types of modes of therapy to create a healthy, whole human being. Pharmaceuticals are part of that, but they also can work hand in hand with alternative therapies. And I think, there are more physicians that are open to that conversation, which is a very exciting thing, because years ago, I remember getting recommendations for patients and having to call the practice and then being afraid to validate these because they're worried that their practices were at risk if they got caught in one way or another. And now, I've done trainings for pharmacology students in palliative care at UCSF. Kaiser has been really open to palliative care, has been the most open, and it seems like that's been the inroads for the medical establishment, accepting cannabis as a viable alternative to a lot of other pharmaceuticals that might create harm or further complications.
Oh, absolutely. And it's incredibly important. And I think there's a growing number of seniors who both are becoming more interested and who could be well served by medical cannabis as an alternative to some of the pharmaceuticals that they're being encouraged to use.
Absolutely. Have you ever seen the Cannabis Club at Rossmore has over 200 people? And it's really awesome to see.
Yeah, no, and it's been a really dramatic cultural shift you were asking sort of about my history and my arc in involvement. And, certainly I was involved from the early days in the California movement around medical cannabis and around adult use legalization. And it's been really interesting to see the arc of public opinion and the arc of people in leadership being willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. And when we first started talking about legalizing first medical and then later adult use cannabis in Oakland and throughout California, most people who were either in elective office or running for elective office would not talk about it. Right. And if they were asked the question, they would try to sidestep it or not answer it and would not be willing to say that they were in favor of legalization. And it was considered, a third rail touchy issue. And I was talking about it openly and supportively very early on. It's interesting now how much that has shifted and how much more people are willing to talk about that.
Yeah, I think, I always say conversations normalization. When I was co-chair of the legalization task force for San Francisco, we had seats with many of city family on there. And when we first started, there were definitely people who were there who probably weren't that excited about being there, but somebody had to sit in that seat. And as we started to have more conversations and there was more normalization around it, I saw how people's views changed. It wasn't that it helped them, I think, do their work better because they had a better understanding of the landscape and who was using cannabis and what the purpose was. Even when we were like getting into conversations about land use and how close a dispensary could be to schools and childcare and things like that, having the conversation that when we get into legalization, even if you're 85 years old and you show up at a dispensary without your ID, you're not going to be able to get in. So youth access isn't really adults being able to properly store their cannabis so that children don't have access to it. And having the conversations about how do we work with having, the traditional market out there or the illicit market, and then that is an access point for children. And if we had a greater ease of entry into the legal market, we would have less of that going on. And we'd also have more tax income for the state. If we lowered those taxes a little, there'd be more people purchasing too.
Oh, absolutely. No, I do think the state rates are too high, but also too complicated and too many different points of calculation and weight and things that make it logistically more difficult as well. So I do think it's important to continue to work on those barriers because they do tend to then undermine the legal market.
Absolutely. And when you're looking at it from, a perspective of people like constituencies working in an industry, creating generational wealth, whether they're in a plant touching business or an ancillary business, the opportunities are endless if we could lower the barrier for entry. And I think that that's one of the things that we've really missed out in as a state. And I'm not sure how we're able to change that because it seems like our state, along with other states, seem to look at cannabis as this stigma-filled panacea to solve all of our problems. But we're very effectively destroying the opportunities that we have to create abundance for our citizens and also to create a safe space for this industry to grow. And when we're getting into national legalization and interstate commerce, we would be one of the hotspots. Our for outdoor sun-grown cannabis, we're one of the most ideal areas for cultivation. And I feel like if we don't really look hard at what we're doing and change some things, we could really miss out. And, a lot of our taxes actually go to groups that actively work against the industry.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think sun-grown is a great point, when they're mostly actually the harms of grow lights, right? Not of the plant. And so, I think that's one of the continuing challenges in terms of, one, being able to acknowledge when there are harms and solve them, right? But also to distinguish, well, what is causing the harm, right? So if a building is wired badly for their electricity, and then running a lot of grow lights that use a lot of electricity, that can cause problems. It could cause fire. It could cause a blackout for the block, right? There's a bunch of things that can go wrong when you're using too much electricity or that's been wired improperly, or both, too much and it's wired improperly,
Yeah.
right? And so I think the question is then people are like, oh, see, that's a problem of cannabis, right? And it's like, well, no, the plants don't overheat and the plants don't cause fire, right? It's badly wired electricity and overuse of electricity. And so being able to support sun grown, both open air sun grown, but also greenhouses can be used for all kinds of stages, so even beyond that. And so I think there really are ways that we can harness things like our amazing California sunshine to then, mitigate things that do come up around, what happens when you have a badly wired indoor grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're just going back to Oakland. A lot of people who are listening may not understand, you think about California cannabis, people immediately think of the Emerald Triangle and Humboldt and Mendocino and how impactful they were on cannabis. But when we talk about cannabis legalization and policy, I'm actually doing some work with a great team that is working on the project called the Cannabis Trail. And Oakland is one of the hubs because so many things happened with policies, starting with the Measure Z clubs and onward, that really created more, uplifted more the idea of medicinal use and legalization and how it could be harnessed to create wealth for the inhabitants of a city. And it's really amazing, especially with like the work that was done, like the very first social equity dispensary, at Blunts and More is here. And then, you also have, there's a wonderful dispensary that's in Temescal as well, that's an equity. And it really shows how that can work. And what are your thoughts about Oakland's history with cannabis policy and the businesses that are starting to pop up?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there were innovations started in Oakland that have then been replicated both throughout the state and throughout the nation. And that includes the equity policy to ensure that communities that have been most targeted and victimized by the war on marijuana and by over-criminalization are provided a reasonable opportunity to be able to then actually be part of the revenue and of the legalization. And that work needs to continue. We have some great successful examples of that, and thank you for sharing those. One on Telegraph Avenue in North Oakland, and one right across the street from the Coliseum in East Oakland, and beyond. And so I think it is really important that work continues to be uplifted, as well as the work of something that is unfortunately not under city control, but requires other actors to act, which is removing criminal penalties and criminal records from people who were historically targeted. That people continue to be denied access to jobs or to housing because of old cannabis convictions. And so, that effort to ensure equity and justice needs to continue. But Oakland issued the first permits for licensed dispensaries in the state, the country, possibly the world, I think, that were official city permits with the city logo. Mm-hmm. And those facilities in those initial phases were very successful and helped uplift communities and areas that needed that support. And also, I think, really helped show that one could do this in a legalized way. That it was possible that you could have a clean, well-lighted, well-maintained, well-regulated facility that paid their taxes and paid their workers properly, and treated the surrounding neighborhood well, and interacted positively with other community members, other businesses in the area. And so that was something that was been a big positive step that happened first in Oakland, and that then many have replicated. And so I do think that's important to honor and uplift, and the people who did that work and fought for that. I did work on that initial ballot measure that passed in Oakland by a very wide margin. and I think then helped inspire others to do similar work. But also the many people in the community, in the industry, in the medical cannabis movement, and in the legalization movement, and folks working around these issues put in a lot of effort to make that a success. And then many of the dispensary people and workers themselves building connections, then created that environment where people could come and see, oh, here is a facility that is responsible and responsibly run. And I think that really helped contribute to that movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been an amazing model for restorative justice and really seeing like what can happen. I was reading about Tucky Blunt the other day, and just the fact that where Tucky's dispensary is not too far from where he was arrested for selling cannabis. And what a story that is, to be able to come back and have this, bright, clean, beautiful store that creates safe access and also representation, which I think is extraordinarily important. And you see, because I think, when we're looking at cannabis now and as things are changing, there is definitely, there's a dispensary for every taste and for every place, for a place for every person to feel comfortable. But I think that the whitewashing of an industry is an extreme mistake, because it's like somebody once told me, brown kids, when they get caught with drugs, they go to jail, and white kids go to rehab. And though that's not always true, there's definitely a pattern that we see, and then that ruins young people's lives. And where do they go after that? And a lot of people may not realize, they think that the fight is over, but we still have people that are in jail that need to get out. Even when we talk about like President Biden doing federal pardons, it's not pardons for selling large amounts of cannabis or trafficking. It's, you got caught in a national park with some weed and you got in trouble for it. And we really, there's a lot to still learn and delve into around this that a lot of people may not know.
Oh, absolutely. And that's part of why I think it's so important that we acknowledge that the work is not over. When Richard Nixon launched his war, he was actually explicit that one of his goals was to target Black people specifically. And there are audio recordings that did not get released until decades later. Right, when he launched this, those audio recordings were not public, but decades later, those audio recordings are saying that the goal was to target Black people. And then also, that he was also talking about targeting anti-war activists was another statement that he made on those tapes. But so the prejudice and racism was overt from the top, and then statistically has been carried forward for decades in terms of who gets arrested, who then, after getting arrested, who gets imprisoned. And then not only does the work need to continue because there are some people still in prison, but there are people who completed their sentence, are out of prison, but because that is still on their record, get denied a job, get denied a home if they apply for a place. And so that also needs to continue to be cleared up.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's also voting rights as well. I mean, especially in this day and age where it's been, as we know, like when I worked for a lawyers committee for civil rights, voting rights was a huge thing. We'd always have some of our colleagues, going during the elections to make sure people were able to get in okay. But now more than ever, we have certain groups that are trying to take away the votes, and also who are people of color. And, not being able to have your, sentences expunged keeps you away from being able to, have your vote and speak your piece as a citizen of this country. And I think that there's something really wrong with that.
Absolutely. No, the right to vote needs to be restored. I mean, frankly, you shouldn't have your right to vote taken away anyway. And then it's only doubly unjust when we're talking about something that is legal and that is treated as legal for some people, right? The fact that a white Republican like Arnold Schwarzenegger could post videos of himself smoking cannabis and run as a Republican candidate for governor, and the Republican right having no problem with that,
Right.
but wanting to use that same act as an excuse to incarcerate and disenfranchise communities of color is it's still a problem today.
It is, and it wasn't this last time that Michael was on the show, but the first time that I had Michael Steele on the show, we were talking, and he was saying that we would be a lot further along with our national cannabis regulation and legalization if the people on that side of the aisle would admit that they supported it more than they show. He said, you know, you have no idea how many people secretly support it and use it that do not come out about it. And I think that there's just this divisiveness that we have in our country right now where we're not necessarily supporting, you know, the people, but we have these agendas that are, I don't know where they're coming from. I mean, yes and no. But it's a very interesting thing where sometimes there's just a fight for a fight. It's like there's one side that has no logic behind it. And as we've seen, you know, there have been people like, you know, John Boehner, who is very against cannabis, but is now on the board, you know, of several cannabis companies. And I'm like, so is this the beginning of normalization? Are people going to start, you know, jumping on it? Is it only when money is on the table that people actually take notice instead of lives? I mean, call me naive, but I think that there's something incredibly wrong with that.
No, there absolutely is. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, what inspired someone to come out of the closet, right? And why there's been such overlap between the LGBT community and some of the early cannabis activism as well, and having to face things and build that courage to deal with something in the face of public pushback can certainly be part of it. But I do think we are now seeing a partisanship that is really problematic, right? And one specific area where we're seeing a tiny bit of bipartisanship, but not quite enough, is around the issue of access to banking. And but the partisan divide continues to keep that from having passed yet at the federal level. And so, you know, certainly for those who don't follow this so closely, right, that cannabis facilities are still denied access to banking services by the federal government, by action of federal law that makes it hard and in many cases impossible to get access to normal banking. And prohibiting access to banking to force facilities to deal in cash causes crime. And so now you have these Republicans choosing to cause crime as a partisan fight. And now there are a handful of Republicans who now are supporting access to banking, but not quite enough yet for it to pass quite yet.
Yeah, it's funny when you think that if somebody is banking, it's actually categorized as money laundering. That's wild to me. And the fact that people aren't thinking about the public safety issues. Because yes, some of these dispensaries have ATMs in them. But, you know, a smart criminal knows that most of the people that are going into the dispensary are going to be spending substantial amounts of money because, let's be honest, it's expensive. It's way more expensive than it was in the medicinal days. So they have cash on them, and then there's cash on the premises. And that is, it's a public safety thing. It puts employees at risk. It puts consumers at risk. And we need to have more conversations about that. And also when we're looking at banking and investing, I mean, you know, it's really hard to get investments in cannabis. And especially, I mean, women in business, it's always been harder for women in business to be able to raise funds for their businesses, and Black and brown folks. But then you throw on the stigma of cannabis. I was just talking to Peter Sue, who is a specialized cannabis banker at Hanover Bank, and he said, you know, he's like, you know, we had safe banking. He's like, but you know, now what they're pushing is called safer banking. So maybe we'll pass it when it's safest banking.
Oh, absolutely. No, keep changing the name of the bill and, you know, there's work going on to get more co-sponsors. And, you know, certainly our member of Congress, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who represents the East Bay area, has been very supportive.
Yes.
So, you know, I want to be clear when I say the federal government isn't doing the right thing. I want to be clear. Our member of Congress here is fighting for the right thing. And there are many others who are. It just hasn't yet hit enough numbers for it to actually pass.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening then is a federal law for paying taxes that are seeking to operate responsibly, and then they're being made to work in cash, which puts them at more risk and makes everything worse. And so you have a federal, essentially a federal pro-crime law.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I have to hand it to Congresswoman Lee. I got the chance to have her on last year, and I just told her, I said, I just want to thank you. Like, she's been such a supportive person for all her constituency, even during the COVID, when we were in the pandemic, her calls that she had, reassuring people and letting them know what was going on. It was nice to be able to tell her, yes, indeed, Barbara Lee does speak for me. Thank you for everything you've done. She has gone out on a limb for the people she represents, and you don't see that as often as you like these days.
Oh, absolutely. No, and we would like to see more of that. That would be super helpful. Yes, and so we do still have pending, yes, now that it's called safer, Senate Bill 2860, which does have actually quite a few sponsors. Starting with Jeff Merkley and Steve Daines, right? So I don't want to imply that there's no support federally. There is work going on,
Right.
but it does need to continue to be uplifted.
Yes, yes, yeah. There are some amazing people representing us and doing the good work, but they have a very uphill battle still because the stigma is still strong. So it isn't to say that there aren't people doing it, but they need a lot more support and help for sure. When we're looking at the current cannabis policies in Oakland, what are your thoughts about things that you'd like to work more on, what you're supporting? Like, what have you been observing? Because you've seen this landscape for some time and seen all the changes. What are your thoughts?
Well, in terms of next steps, I would say there's a couple. One, which I've mentioned, is in terms of continuing to right the wrongs and the racial injustices and helping, around record expungement and around access to jobs, access to housing policies, and making sure that we're not excluding job applicants around cannabis and prior cannabis use and off the job use and things like that are not appropriate reasons to exclude someone from a job. That is a big win-win of a policy change because it also then helps fill vacancies, right? So when we talk about, we want to get potholes filled and we want to get crime solved and things like that, right? If you're rejecting applicants for pothole fillers and fingerprint analysts because they have an old cannabis record, then not only is that a wrong to the individual applicant, but then that also means then positions end up staying vacant and the public doesn't get those services. So that's something I'm working on that I think is a win-win, that at first seems like it's a cannabis issue, but it's also a public service delivery issue, and making sure the people get served, which means we need to be able to hire to fill positions. So I think that's an important one. Something else we're doing, thanks to a change in state law, is around special events. You may recall that in California, it used to be the case that you were only allowed to do special cannabis events at county fairgrounds. And there are no county fairgrounds in Oakland. But we did work successfully to pass a change in that state law. And so now local jurisdictions have more discretion to designate locations to allow cannabis special events. And so that's something that we've started rolling out in Oakland so that people can have, a variety of events and gatherings where cannabis can be allowed for adults at those events. And I think that's also important toward building a positive social dynamic, that it isn't just, go buy it and then consume it at home alone, but that, just like you can have a concert that has alcohol, that you can have cannabis as part of events for adults.
I think that's great. And this year, the Emerald Cup will be definitely be some biz and have cannabis cafes where people could sit and have a beverage or, and maybe enjoy edibles or be one of the biggest questions that, when I worked in a dispensary, when people would be coming from out of town, they'd purchase something and they'd be like, well, well, where can I use this? And it's like, well, not in your hotel room. Not that.
And preferably not in your car. And then what, on the street corner? Well, but you're not supposed to on the street corner, right? So absolutely, I think that's really a valuable step that we need to take as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, I have a question that's not cannabis related.
Okay.
Is there any hope for the Oakland A's?
Oh, there is always hope for for all kinds of things, and first of all, let me clarify for anybody who may not know, the Oakland city government has approved not only one but two major development sites at which we have approved for use for development of a new ballpark and related development, and both of those sites were requested by Major League Baseball. The Coliseum site, which of course has BART, has Amtrak, has freeway, has an airport, and Howard Terminal, which is waterfront, connected to the Broadway corridor, next to a ferry that'll take you throughout the region. And Major League Baseball actually requested each of those sites from us, and we approved both of them. And so what does that mean? In California, when developers talk about developing large projects in California, they'll often say that getting environmental clearance is a challenging step to get through. And what this means is we have done that for these two sites. And so we have sites that are ready to go. I don't know how many of your listeners are closely following the twists and turns of the Major League Baseball saga, but the A's announced last year that they had a binding agreement on a 49-acre site in Las Vegas. 2 weeks after that, they announced, oops, we no longer have a binding agreement on that site. We now have a binding agreement on a 9-acre site, which many said was not quite big enough to put what they said they were going to put there. Now, this week, they've admitted that what they released depictions of won't actually fit on the 9-acre site that they announced. And they said they're working on options, potentially a redesign of the whole structure based on that. And so there is not yet a plan for Las Vegas, nor is there financing for it. The Las Vegas plan is actually significantly more expensive than the Oakland plan, because Oakland, having the best weather in the world, does not require a roof to have a ballpark. So the roof makes it much, much more expensive to build in Las Vegas. So it's cheaper to build in Oakland. It's faster to build in Oakland. Not only could they still build at Howard Terminal, but they could also still build at the Coliseum, which is ready to go in terms of the site. And so that is absolutely an option, particularly given that the Las Vegas plans keep seeming to be not quite working out.
I hope that they stay. My husband's been following the A's since the 70s, and we went to the reverse boycott game. And I think it's really, I mean, I remember when I first moved to San Francisco from Michigan, I was like, there's hardly anything in San Francisco, and Oakland has all these amazing sports teams. And it's like things have changed, like those heartbreaking losing the Raiders, and we need to keep the teams. I mean, I am not a particularly sporty person. I was a theater debate nerd. But I understand, like, when I go to games, I see the enthusiasm and the fun and like how it brings a community together, and I think it's really important. And if it was at the Coliseum, there's an amazing consumption space
right there.
Right there for pre and post, game.
That's right. And by the way, if you are coming to the Coliseum for a game, a concert, or any other event, you can park your car in the Coliseum parking lot and then walk across the street to the dispensary before the event. And then you don't, then your car can already be there, and then you can walk back and go in, and that's right. And that dispensary does have an outdoor consumption lounge.
Yep. A very friendly, safe one.
Yes, and they're lovely. And the other thing I should say in terms of sports and entertainment and what it means to have events that bring people together and activate community, and also, by the way, create jobs and create tax revenue, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about sports, right, it's not really just about sports, right? It's also about jobs and tax revenue. And so one of the things that I've been working on together with the other staff at the Coliseum Authority is bringing in more events, more concerts, more sports teams, and you know, for folks who are wondering, what, who is coming here and being here, we have had this past year our most successful year ever at the Oakland Arena and Coliseum in terms of revenue and bringing in events and bringing in bookings. And we are now having new professional soccer teams, Oakland Roots Soccer, which is the men's team, and Oakland Soul Soccer, which is a women's team, are developing in Oakland. And we now have a new baseball team called the Oakland Ballers, also known as the Oakland Bees, that is developing in Oakland, as well as a whole range of concerts and other events that we've been working to bring in. And so we actually increased revenue more last year than any prior year by this work to bring in more events. And now with both the Roots and Soul Soccer and the Ballers baseball coming, we have the ability to continue to expand on that. So that work is underway as well. And the other thing worth sharing is we also have a development team called the African American Sports and Entertainment Group that is creating a whole development plan for the Coliseum property.
That's awesome. And I know people are ready to go out and have fun, especially after having a couple years of everything kind of having to slow down to keep people safe. It's a perfect time to be able to go out and enjoy sports and entertainment. And I know, like, several years ago, I went and saw Prince over at the Coliseum, and perfect evening there.
Oh, absolutely. And Oakland is a city that has led in arts and culture and sports and entertainment and innovation and thought leadership and programs, whether it's, the legalization of cannabis or even the Oakland Core program, which trains neighbors and neighborhoods how to respond to emergencies like earthquakes and fires so that people know how to get in and out and how to help their neighbors and how to have what they need. To the Black Panther Party starting the free breakfast program for school kids, right? That Oakland has been a place where innovation that then gets replicated nationwide for positive things that serve communities have happened. And so, with this Coliseum site that is central to the whole region and readily accessible by transportation, we absolutely want to make sure that we are developing and uplifting that in a manner that supports the community, supports equity, and supports jobs and positive activation.
Yeah, it's become such a destination. I mean, even when you compare, like, years ago, San Francisco was more of the destination for culinary. And now there are so many great restaurants and culinary experiences here in Oakland. And people are, for those of you who don't live here, you don't realize that once a friend moves over the bridge, you don't see them that much anymore. But now with all the different opportunities and things to see in Oakland, we get a lot more of our friends from San Francisco coming over and taking part, which is, it's beautiful. But in many ways, to me, Oakland reminds me of a lot of the things that I loved about San Francisco in the 90s before things started to kind of change a little bit more. I still love my SF, but it's a very different place than it was when I first got here.
Well, thank you. No, absolutely. We are blessed to have, the best food, the best weather, and the best people. And so it's a great honor. And thank you. It's such a pleasure to connect with you.
Oh, thank you so much for being on the show, Rebecca. I really appreciated our talk and just, all the different things that you've done to help create, a stronger industry which just live. And for people who want to see what you're working on or what you're doing, how would they go about doing that?
Absolutely. So my website is kaplanforoakland.org. That's KAPLANFOROAKLAND.org. And our email address at City Hall is @large, so that's ATLARGE, @large, @oaklandca.gov.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to all the wonderful things that are coming down in our state and in our city, and I look forward to future conversations with you as well.
Well, thank you so much. And on Twitter, I'm Kaplan for Oakland with the number 4. And you're welcome to follow me. And thank you so very much for having me on. It's great to talk with you.
Thank you. And everyone, remember, if you like listening, please give us a review, share it with a friend. Let us know what your favorite episodes are. And if you'd like to stay in touch over social media, we are Planted with Sara Pion on Facebook and Planted with Sara on Instagram and Twitter. You can also go to our website, www.plantedwithsara.com, or listen to us on our parent network, Radio Misfits Network, where there are other great podcasts, like one of my favorites, the Winemakers Podcast. So check it out. You can listen to Planted wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, whether that's Pandora, Spotify, Amazon, Google, Apple, Stitcher. Tune in. We are there. So join us. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, it's a wild world out there. Be good to one another. Until next time, take care.